Hello, everyone. This is Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine It podcast. And today I have Dr. Tom Weber with me. Dr. Tom Weber is a swine technical manager for AB Vista. Tom, how are you today?
I am doing good. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well. The sun is shining here, and so we can't complain too much.
A little bit overcast here in Northwest Ohio, but at least the temperature is nice. So.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Tom, if you wouldn't mind, I know sometimes our audience doesn't always know some of our speakers, so would you mind just giving a little bit of an introduction about who you are?
Sure. I am Tom Weber. Grew up on a farm and livestock operation in southern Indiana. Funny thing about that is I actually grew up around cattle and sheep and really didn't generate an interest in swine until I finished my bachelor's degree in animal science from Purdue University. So after I'd finished my bachelor's degree, I realized, well, I better find a job somewhere because the operation at home wasn't large enough to absorb one more person from an income perspective. So I had the opportunity to join some acquaintances of ours who were basically in the middle of upgrading their swine production operation. Back at that time, we're talking around the year 2000. So it was about 600, 700 sows, so decent size for a family size operation. You know, what's interesting about that operation at that time, we were going from pen mating with boars to crate gestation and AI. Kind of funny now how the industry is going back to pen gestation again, but nonetheless, it was a great opportunity to learn about, how to AI sows, flowing pigs on a weekly schedule from a batch system, etc. I was very fortunate enough on that operation that they were very high on the learning curve. So we always had folks in from genetics companies and nutrition companies coming in and talking about the latest research that they were generating and working on. So that kind of stimulated an interest of mine. Hey, maybe at some point in time, I want to go back to school and get my graduate degrees so I can be involved in swine research and nutrition. So I had the opportunity to go back to Purdue University and get my master's degree and Ph.D. in nutrition and immunology under Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗪𝗀𝗀 and 𝘧𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗀 at that time. After I finished my degree in a short postdoctoral fellowship in the pharmaceutical industry, I had the opportunity to go out to Iowa and work at USDA Agricultural Research Service there in Ames, working with Dr. Brian Kerr in the area of swine nutrition and really understanding some of these higher fiber ingredients that were coming out of the ethanol industry at the time. So kind of an interest of mine, in the fiber arena generated back then, not only fiber, but some of the aspects of the degradation products, such as short-chain fatty acids, such as butyrate. We did some research on that as well. After several years at USDA, I was recruited to industry at Elanco Animal Health to help them do R&D in their fledgling enzyme business at the time, and also had the opportunity to be involved in animal health research from a pharmaceutical perspective as well. So that was a great opportunity to learn about really the regulatory side of things as well, not only in the US, but globally in terms of what it really took to be able to get certain claims on products. After a couple of years at Elanco, I realized, well, I wanted to get back to the nutrition field a little bit more. So I was recruited to Kalmbach Feeds here in Northwest Ohio. And that was a great opportunity to be involved in swine production. And I also had the opportunity to help bring online a brand new feed mill as well and learn about some of the nuances of feeding pelleted diets from wean to finish in an operation. After about 3.5 years there, I was recruited to my current role at AB Vista, where I basically serve our customers in North America. So that's kind of where I sit currently.
Well, that's great. You've had certainly a lot of different experiences, a lot of good production experience, as well as a wide range of nutrition exposure. When we talked today about what you were going to want to discuss, fiber came up. Obviously, that's where you've done a lot of your research, and I think it's a really good topic. We don't really talk much about fiber in the United States. We do, but we don't, right? So, distillers has fiber. So anytime anybody says we need fiber, just throw distillers in and we're good. But how we look at fiber in the United States is certainly different than how the European countries, for example, look at fiber and factor it in. So could you maybe just, start the discussion as to why you're so focused on fiber in the United States and where you think some of that value may be?
Sure, certainly. As I'd mentioned back in my career at USDA, during my time focused on ingredients coming out of the ethanol industry, a lot of those ingredients were high fiber by their nature, just because the starch was being taken out of the corn, and we were basically left with fiber, mineral, and protein at that point in time. So we were really trying to figure out, okay, how well can the pig utilize these quote higher fiber ingredients? Now, that being said, we do know that there is, a greater abundance of fibrous feedstuffs in this distillers grains and ethanol byproducts. And that's where perhaps some of the global aspect of it comes in when you talk about ingredients. You go over to Europe, where they use more small grains, and there's different byproducts that are being brought in with different fiber levels and fiber types. And when you think about fiber, I think a lot of it comes back to the definition of what are we calling fiber, right? Some of it comes back to the analytics around it. I know, having spent several years in the feed industry, I'm still somewhat surprised we're using crude fiber as an indicator on our feed labels when it really doesn't get into some of the functional aspects of fiber. And I think now some of the later analytical aspects, we are able to dive more deeply into the functional aspects as well.
So let's start with the phase of production. So let's start with the sow, right? She's near and dear to my heart.
Yep.
I've spent a lot of time with her. We've always talked about fiber being important, particularly in gestation when she's on a controlled ration in terms of her amount that she's fed every day. But what other value do we see with fiber with both a gestating and a lactating sow?
Yep, and as you indicated, obviously during gestation and limit-fed animals, I remember dumping several tons of bags of alfalfa meal into gestation diets, almost 20 years ago, and that was more from a satiety perspective. Obviously the folks in Europe have been thinking about it along that lines as well, because there's some regulatory component there, where they're supposed to feed a more bulky diet to sows that are limit-fed, just from a satiety perspective. But in addition to improved satiety, there's other benefits from a metabolic perspective, perhaps. When you think about some of the degradation products of fiber fermentation, such as short-chain fatty acids, which change up the metabolism a little bit, and enable that sow to perhaps be a little bit more efficient, I guess is the word I'm looking for, from an energetic perspective, especially as she's limit-fed. And not only that, as she transitions to being limit-fed, a relatively low energy diet to a higher energy, higher amino acid dense lactation diet. And there's some published data sets out there showing benefits in terms of if one feeds a higher fiber diet during gestation, you can potentially see improvements in feed consumption during lactation, as well as improved weaning weights as well. And then some of the more recent data sets coming out of the EU, showing decreases in farrowing duration with a higher fiber diet around that farrowing time as well.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the papers I remember is Dr. Gretchen Hill put one out many years ago where it listed a couple different fiber types. And I just remember alfalfa meal being listed on there as the one that improved milk yield and some of the lactation performance, right? So those discussions have been around in the United States a long time, but we don't tend to really feed a lot of fiber unless it's convenient for us, right? Because the conversation is, oh, we can use soy hulls, but soy hulls are expensive. And so what options do we have for good quality fiber, right? Because you kind of touched on it. We have good digestible fiber that has value, and then we have indigestible fibers. So what types of good quality products should we be looking at for fibrous components for the sow?
That's a good question, and you bring up a good point about alfalfa meal. I mean, there was a lot of work done anywhere from 30 to 40 years ago looking at alfalfa meal in sow diets. And interestingly, there was some benefit shown even in terms of sows that lasted through parity 3 when they fed a higher alfalfa meal diet. I think that was some work that 𝘨𝗏𝗪𝗏 had done back in the 1970s, early 1980s. Giving a shout out to Steve there. But in terms of fiber sources, as we well know, besides some of the ethanol-derived co-products and maybe wheat middlings here in the Eastern Corn Belt and other locations in the U.S., there's not a huge source of economical, high-quality fibrous ingredients, especially when you talk about soluble fiber. In terms of breaking down the functional characteristics of fiber, there's some data showing that it's actually the balance of fiber, in terms of ratio of insoluble fiber to soluble fiber, that may be more indicative of the physiological effects of fiber than just fiber per se. So I think some of this comes back to having an understanding of the fiber that's in our current ingredients that we're feeding. I know the current company I'm working for AB Vista, we have a database of NIR data on global ingredients, and the variation within an ingredient, for example, corn or wheat midds or even DDGs, is somewhat interesting. And is there a way to even capitalize on that when it comes to formulating our diets from a fiber perspective? I think now as we start generating more of these analytical tools to be able to delve down into, okay, what are the fibers and fiber types and fiber sources that are associated with benefits and performance, I think we can start asking more of those questions and validating those results that are seen in smaller scale studies that clearly need some replication.
And I think you bring up a very good point. So you talked, and we'll come back to one of them because you actually had a couple in there. One was on the ratio of soluble versus insoluble, and the other you mentioned was just analysis of ingredients. And so, is there an appropriate method for analysis that we should be looking at to really get a good understanding of fiber and the fiber types?
Yeah, and that's obviously been the million-dollar question for the past couple of years, especially in the U.S. Obviously our feed labels in the U.S. are based on crude fiber or have to depict crude fiber levels. We've moved a little bit past that in the non-ruminant space to go to the NDF-ADF scheme. We can take it one level beyond that in terms of complexity and go to our, soluble fiber, insoluble fiber, lignin, add that up and get our TDF. Obviously, from a lab analysis perspective, we don't have the time or budgets as commercial nutritionists to send a lot of feed samples off to the lab to have TDF done. But that was one of my frustrations when I was in the commercial swine industry, feeding hogs real time. You'd send an ingredient off for analysis. Well, by the time you got the results back, the ingredient was already gone. So that's where I think some of these tools, such as NIR, are becoming very powerful now to be able to come in and do more real-time analysis. Not only in a shorter time period, but we can run more samples in a day because one person can run a heck of a lot of samples on an NIR in a day versus wet lab analysis.
Absolutely. Is there a certain ratio we should be looking at? Do you have one in mind today? Because I think about all the different ratios we have in our formulation software, and it's easy to create one as long as we put the right information into the ingredients. So is there a ratio you think we should be targeting?
I don't know if there's necessarily an answer today. I think we're kind of getting closer in terms of having an understanding. If I remember right, a common U.S. gestation diet's about 9 to 10 to 1 ratio of insoluble to soluble. If you look at some of the more recent publications, maybe a 3 to 4 in a perfect world. Again, that may be somewhat hard to achieve with U.S., at least in the Midwest, corn, soybean meal-based diets. The other aspect to look at is a grams of fiber per day intake, whether it's TDF or soluble fiber. Some of the data are indicating that maybe we ought to be targeting about 400 grams per day total dietary fiber intake and about 70 grams per day of soluble fiber intake for gestating sows.
Perfect. So you were saying TDF a lot, and you did respond back with the definition, but total digestible fiber. So just for our audience, if they're not familiar with TDF and what that means, but you talk about how we go from crude fiber down a step to NDF and ADF, and then we go down to total digestible fiber, TDF. Why should we go that far, right? So we have the same discussion with energy. We've gone from ME to NE. So why do I want to go to TDF? What's the value? What's it going to bring to me?
I think it brings in some value in terms of clarity of the functional properties of the fiber that we're feeding. And are we able to formulate getting closer to those targeted values that should bring benefit, right? I almost think about it, we're not quite that granular yet in terms of, amino acids from an analogy perspective, right? We know what amino acid ratios that we should be targeting for optimal performance. Can we get there with dietary fiber? I think even lipids, for example, I think we're getting closer when we think about omega-6 to omega-3 ratios, for example. Even though that's another podcast on its own right in terms of talking about the appropriate lipid balance to be feeding and lipid quality, et cetera. But getting back to the fiber aspect of it, I think it enables us to have a better understanding of some of the functional properties of the fiber that way, rather than just formulating off of a straight crude fiber or NDF.
So let's go back into the gestating sow for a minute. when we talk about fiber, what type of mode of action are we really looking at with fiber? So you mentioned short chain fatty acids, but let's talk a little bit more about the mode of action of fiber in sows, because I think the gestating sow is clearly different than any other type of pig we deal with. And so let's talk a little bit more about what's happening with fiber in that sow.
Yep, and I don't know if the mechanisms have been 100% pinned down. I think it's probably a combination of several different mechanisms. Obviously from a composition of digestive perspective, you're changing the viscosity of the digestive for one thing. You're also, as you alluded to, increasing fermentation in the hindgut. There could also be more of a physical component in terms of a scratch factor right in the gut, leading to increased mucin production and a change in intestinal barrier function as well. And then obviously a whole host of effects on the host microbiome, which the tools are out there these days to even have a better understanding of that now as well. So I think it's a combination of mechanisms that are leading to some of the benefits or alterations that we're seeing when we're feeding a higher level of fiber.
What about lactation? So we talk a lot about fiber in gestation, and I've seen diets 40-50% distillers grains, right? So we know we have lots of insoluble fiber in that case, but what about lactation? Should I worry? I think I've written a handful of papers on 30% distillers, and it doesn't seem to hurt much, but should we think about it, or is it really not a factor in lactation?
I think that's a good question. Obviously one needs to keep in mind that the energy and nutrient density of those diets, especially going into the summertime here as we go into that season, as long as we don't limit that sow's intake, from a capacity perspective to enable her to take in nutrients to support her lactation and subsequent reproduction, I think some added fiber is perhaps good, especially around that fiber or that farrowing time point from a constipation perspective and a fecal quality perspective as well, adding some bulk to the diet that way. And you're right, I've seen some diets myself that are relatively high in distillers grains, for example, and even wheat mids and some pelleted diets that I've put together before. Sows seem to do just fine on that, and at least anecdotally, the farm managers seem to think that they did better on higher fiber diets, at least certain genetic lines. I think that may be another area that's ripe for research after the gestating sow aspect of it as well, as having an understanding of elevated fiber, especially in these hyperprolific sows, that we may know are somewhat limited on nutrient intake capacity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. Certainly there's a lot of value particularly when we think about the fermentation aspect of the fiber. And I've heard some rumblings in the past of maybe we should increase amino acids if we're going to feed more fiber. Any thoughts on that?
That's a good question, especially when you think about the potential impact of fiber on amino acid digestion in the small intestine. And to your point, I think that's an area that perhaps needs some more research, even from maybe a digestibility perspective, to go back in and look at how much are we really altering that digestibility of the amino acids that we're trying to target. Mm-hmm. But obviously, if you go around the globe, some folks are feeding higher levels of fiber just by virtue of the ingredients they're feeding. And their sows seem to be somewhat productive. So
sow is a pretty forgiving animal, is what I've learned. Unfortunately, though, it comes off of her own body, and that's hard to measure sometimes as well. And we've seen that in a lot of the research that's done. So it can confound a lot of our discussions and our research when we start thinking about her and her abilities to mobilize tissue.
Yep, and obviously those are some harder questions and longer duration questions to answer from a study perspective when we start talking about gestation and lactation in sows.
Yes, absolutely. And then we can get into the whole discussion of longevity, right? And that's an even longer, a longer review of what we have to do.
Yep, and it seems a lot of folks don't have the patience to sit around and conduct those types of studies and wait for the results on them. And also, as you're well aware of, sow research can be somewhat labor intensive as well. So,
yes, just a little bit for sure. Well, one of the other things that you and I had talked about before we started today was really fiber in the nursery. So we don't, at least I don't, tend to look at an NDF or a crude fiber component when I formulate nursery diets, especially that early pig, right? I'm focused on lactose. I'm focused on, enough digestible ingredients in there for that baby pig to get started. So why should I worry about fiber in an early nursery diet?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think that's what's interesting about it is there's an emerging field of research now in that area. There was some data that came out of Europe in the last 5 to 10 years showing that feeding increased insoluble fiber levels, which is kind of counterintuitive. That first phase or two post-weaning was actually bringing some benefit in terms of setting up that pig for subsequent nursery performance, in terms of allowing that pig to transition better to the later nursery period when we transitioned onto more, quote, simple type diets. It seems to be there's some benefit of more inert fiber, at least in that phase 1 or phase 2 diet in terms of, perhaps improving fecal consistency and as well as improving digestive enzyme capacity and capability as well. What's interesting is now there seems to be a little bit more focus in the US, even looking at some of our more traditional high fiber ingredients, whether it's, rice hulls or wheat midds here in the US. There was actually an abstract or two at Midwest Animal Science meetings, which I was glad to see this year in terms of bringing that concept here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we've certainly have seen some work years ago. Dr. Pettigrew did a bunch of work with rice and its value against E. coli and certainly some enteric pathogens. And I haven't kept up on that data very well. So are we seeing an increase in mucin production in those nursery pigs if we're feeding fiber, or has that been looked at very well?
I don't think that has necessarily been looked at very well at that early nursery phase. We know later on in production when you feed higher fiber, you start to perhaps increase mucin and maybe change the mucin subtypes as well. And then, as you mentioned, the whole pathogen binding capacity as well. I listened to an interesting online presentation last week that Cargill had put on, actually talking about basically rice hulls and its ability to bind salmonella and decrease salmonella colonization in birds. And what was interesting there is even the variation between rice cultivar types. So not only the variation got me thinking, not only the variation between ingredients, but within an ingredient in terms of when you talk about the fiber characteristics, which makes things a little bit more complex, but a little bit more interesting to study that way.
Yeah, that is really interesting. From a nutritionist perspective, my mind is just blown, right? Because now I don't have just to worry about rice hulls, but I have to worry about what cultivar it's coming from. But in addition to that, when you're talking about how much fiber in those early nursery diets, how much are you talking in terms of percent or grams? Can you provide that information?
From the data that I've seen from an insoluble fiber perspective, that first nursery phase or two post-weaning, some are just north of, 10% added wheat mid, so get you close to where I think one would need to be.
And palatability and pellet quality, we're okay on that?
Yeah, and obviously from a pellet quality perspective, one would expect if you bring more wheat products into the diet, you should at least, in theory, create a better pellet. Although I have been surprised sometimes.
Well, I think that's always cinemas, right? We hear the word fiber and we think, oh, the pellet quality is not going to be there. So I think it's a good question to ask. But yeah, I would agree. It's not always perfect, but we hope 9 times out of 10 wheat midds work. So I think that's a really good discussion. I know years ago I had seen some work on soluble fiber in nursery pigs, not insoluble. So I think that's an interesting concept, is that we're actually going to insoluble, but in sows we're talking more soluble fiber. So
now, just for clarity, it's really the insoluble, really in that immediate post-weaning period. Now, once you get to about a week and a half, that 10 to 14 days post-weaning, and the pigs are consuming feed more readily, then there appears to be some benefit of weaving in some more of your soluble fiber sources.
Okay.
To really start kickstarting that fermentation in the hindgut that way. Now, what's interesting on that is the European data will suggest that perhaps the pathogen load in the pig and the environment may have an implication in terms of how well that pig responds to that soluble fiber. If you're in a more, quote, dirty environment, soluble fiber may not be a beneficial concept to bring into your nursery pig diet, just because it may provide more fodder for those pathogens to ferment.
Right. And I think that's a really good point, is, we've not really put health in here. We've talked about it a little bit, that it can help with health, but I think that's a good point, is that we also could have a potential negative if we're not watching that carefully. particularly in that early nursery when those pigs are so susceptible to enteric challenges. I think years ago when we saw some potential 𝗵𝘂𝗪𝗏 issues right in late finishing, we were talking about fiber. And I think that conversation still continues today. So is there a good fiber or a bad fiber for a finishing pig? Which direction should we be looking at?
Yeah, and that brings up a good question. Obviously some of the work done there at Iowa State with Dr. 𝗵𝘂𝗪. Recently, I saw some of his data showing the benefits of feeding more soluble fiber during a 𝗵𝘂𝗪𝗏 challenge, which is kind of interesting, is that's kind of opposite of some of the work done, about 10 or 12 years ago out of the University of Minnesota, showing that there may be benefit of feeding higher levels of DDGs for a 𝘨𝑚 challenge. So that even brings more complexity into this whole fiber picture, from a fiber composition perspective and pathogen challenge perspective, that one may perhaps be needing to keep in the back of their mind when formulating diets or bringing in different fiber sources.
That's what I remember. In fact, when I was doing nutrition work, it was, oh, well, the DDGs are going to be good for this, but not for that. So, you kind of have to balance it out. But so yeah, I think that's a very good point. Is again, we need to be mindful of maybe what enteric pathogens we might be dealing with to appropriately select the correct ingredient to match our fiber needs for our pigs. It's a very good point. Any other key points today that you'd like to discuss that I'm missing?
I guess one key take-home point is that, yes, fiber is important. We're slowly but surely generating the tools to have a better understanding of dietary fiber and how to best utilize it strategically. So basically, that's my main take-home point for today.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think you've done a nice job of giving us some information today when we think about particularly grams of fiber for a sow, and to be thinking about TDF rather than just crude fiber. And certainly to be thinking about the differences between soluble and insoluble fiber and how different phases of production or different health statuses might alter what type of fiber source we should be using. So I think that's a very good discussion, and it kind of helps lead us through a little bit more about what the Europeans have done and bring that to the United States and make it applicable. So thank you for that.
Yep, thank you.
Well, as we wrap up our discussion today, Tom, as you know, we like to ask 3 questions of our guest speaker. The first question I have for you is, what's your favorite swine resource book? What's your go-to?
So kind of a non-original answer here. It would have to be the 2012 Swine NRC. I mean, that is still a resource that I pull on almost every day, that I have an opportunity to be at my desk looking at something from a nutritional perspective. I still go back to the 2012 NRC for something. It's actually hard to believe that resource is almost a decade old already.
It's probably time for a new review, I think. But yeah, I have both two sets of NRC, and I pulled my 2012 off this morning. So it's absolutely a good go-to resource. How about non-swine resource books? Anything that you're currently reading that you enjoy, that you'd like to share with the group?
Yeah, I just finally wrapped up completing a book called Never Split the Difference. It's a book on negotiation skills by a retired FBI agent named Chris Voss. He was one of their head negotiators for like terrorist kidnapping type situations and stuff like that. And it really goes into, obviously I'm not going to be negotiating for a kidnap release or anything like that, hopefully, but more along the lines of, how do you negotiate business deals? How do you negotiate with potential customers? Or even how do you negotiate, with your kids to do something that you would like them to do? And really brought to light the importance of having good negotiation skills, to be able to use those across life circumstances that way.
That's a good book. I'll have to write that one down and review it. I've not heard of that one, so I'll check that one out. The last question we have of you today, Tom, is really around when you think about people that are successful, what characteristics or qualities do you see in them that you think leads them to be successful?
Obviously, besides being passionate and hardworking, the other thing that I have seen successful swine professionals do is really be open-minded and be willing to collaborate and learn from others. As we talked about today, even this fiber issue is somewhat complex, and not one of us really has all the answers. and especially with some of the tools being generated in other fields that enable us to really start to answer some of these questions, that collaborative piece really becomes important.
I think that's a very good point. Wonderful. Well, again, Tom, we thank you for your time today. It's certainly been a great discussion around fiber and particularly sows and what we should be thinking about, as well as our early nursery pig. So again, we want to thank you from the 𝘨iNet group and wish you all the best. And again, for our audience, this is Tom Weber from AB Vista.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.